Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
So at this point, we normally go around and introduce ourselves, and for the newcomers to the group, if you don't mind saying that you're over here, we'll be sure to welcome you. So let me start with myself. I'm Oswaldo.
Douglas Hall.
Mike.
Ian.
Adam. Harry.
John. Hello. Amir. David.
My name is Gary.
Ray Allen. Kevin.
I'm Patrick.
I'm George.
My name is Pat.
I'm Jack.
I'm Mark.
David.
I'm Tony.
Michael.
I'm Doug.
Paul.
I'm David.
Jim.
I'm Joe Castrovinci.
My name is Mark.
Paul.
John.
Robert.
Kyle.
Richard Azzolini.
Jerry.
Peter. I'm Hal.
Scott.
Anybody else?
Rich.
All right, well, welcome everybody. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Susan Moon, who's been here before, as I understand, a friend of the Sangha. She's a writer and teacher, and for many years was the editor of Turning Wheel, which is a journal of socially engaged Buddhism. She's the author of The Life and Letters of Tofu Roshi, a humor book about an imaginary Zen master, and editor of Not Turning Away, the Practice of Engaged Buddhism. And I hope that you can also tell us about your new book at some point later on, Susan. Susan's short stories and essays have been published widely. Sue has been a Zen student since 1976. She's been practicing in the lineage of Suzuki Roshi at Berkeley Zen Center, Tassajara Zen Mountain Monastery, Green Gulch Farm, and is now with Zoketsu Norman Fischer's Everyday Sangha. She received entrustment as a lay teacher in 2005, and she's also the mother of two grown sons and the grandmother of Paloma. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you very much, Oswaldo. It's really nice to be back here. I've been here quite a few times, and I see familiar faces. And as I always say, I just really appreciate being invited into your Sangha and being kind of an honorary gay man for the morning. Rare treat for me. So maybe I'll just, since you just did the introduction, I'll add on to it. My latest book is called This Is Getting Old. The subtitle is Zen Thoughts on Aging with Humor and Dignity. And I actually spoke about it here right after it was published. But I just wanted to say it's still available. I don't have copies to sell today, but I brought a copy. You can see what it looks like, and I'll put it out there while we're having tea. And it's very easy to get on Amazon or ordering at your local independent bookstore, or it's on Kindle. So, and it's a good.
It's really good.
It's a good gift for somebody you know who might be getting a little bit older.
Nobody that we know over here.
Not you personally. So, today, on a more somber note, I want to talk about grief, and I think it's on many of our minds, the terrible killing in Connecticut, the school killings. So I'm going to get to that. But I've been thinking about grief a lot, and when I first came to Buddhism, about 35 years ago. I think it was really out of an impulse to try and understand death, life and death. What the heck is it? How could it be that people could be alive and then they're not there anymore? And I just couldn't understand it, and I can't say that I totally understand it now. But something about this mystery, this mysterious passage, is one of the things that I think brings many people perhaps to spiritual practice. And I had 2 very young children when I started, and I just loved them so wholeheartedly that, in a way, that kind of highlighted my fear of death and of suffering and my attachment to my children and thinking, well, what if I died? What if they died? Then I think that, well, I have experienced the death of a number of loved ones, and as we get older, this happens more and more, and I have continued to study this strange mystery, and I just 5 days ago, one of my very, very closest friends died, a woman who's been my friend for 40 years, and was a wonderful teacher in Berkeley. And so it's very fresh in me. What is this grief? What happened to her? And she was sick for many years. She failed over a period of about 5 years from kind of complications and pneumonia and various failures of health that were somewhat mysterious in themselves. And but she was sick for 5 years and failing gradually, and she had been an extremely big and lusty and funny, outgoing woman who was the most undead person you could imagine. And then over a 5-year period, she just got smaller and smaller and thinner and weaker and weaker. And basically she died of malnutrition, I think, more than anything. And it was just a few days ago, and I was there when she died. And so it wasn't a surprise. She was failing for a long time. But even so, even though she was 69, she'd been sick, she was in pain, it was a blessing in a way. And she has grown children and a granddaughter and people who loved her, who miss her, but it was some relief that she was out of her pain. And still sitting there with her dead body right after she had died and seeing a person who's dead looks so different than a person who's alive. They're so clearly dead. The life is not there, and her skin was completely white, and it just wasn't her. She was not present. Where was she? This strange, strange mystery, and it was a shock, and it's still a shock to me, even though that death was not, it was sad, it was unnecessary in some ways. Perhaps her health could have been better taken care of, but it wasn't a tragedy in the sense of, for example, this killing in Connecticut, these killings in Connecticut. It wasn't out of the order of human events exactly, and yet it was still difficult, and still there is still grief. And so there's the death, and then there's the grief afterwards. And so how do we deal with that? What do we do with our grief? And that's a question I continue to ask myself. And there is, we know about impermanence. It's one of the teachings of the Buddha, and my friend Mary was a kind of living example of impermanence. The impermanence of her body was just making itself manifest over a period of 5 years. It was changing all the time and getting smaller and smaller and thinner and thinner. And so how do we accept impermanence? And impermanence is really our friend, because we lose people because of impermanence, but people are born because of impermanence too. That's what life is. We wouldn't have our life if it weren't for impermanence. If we were permanent, we wouldn't be very appealing to each other. We would be rigid and plastic or something. So, but I do want to turn to these school killings in Connecticut, and which are such a different order of tragedy, and it boggles the mind how this kind of loss could be inflicted and where it comes from. I mean, there was a human being who was the agent of these deaths, and who was he, and what was his suffering, and and then what would Buddha say about it? Saying, well, what would Buddha say about these killings? And I'm not sure what he would say about it, but he did teach that, I mean, in Buddha's time too, there were terrible events that happened that were kind of out of the ordinary. I mean, we can think, well, certainly there weren't semi-automatic weapons in Buddha's time, and it wouldn't have been so easy to kill a lot of small children all at once in a couple of minutes. However, there were terrible, terrible things that people still were doing to each other in times past. And so, for example, there is the story of Angulimala in the Buddhist teachings, which is kind of an amazing story of a man in Buddha's time. It may be a legend, but it may be true that this man was a very brilliant scholar, and but for some reason he had a very jealous teacher who he upset, who told him that he needed to, in order to get back into the teacher's good graces, or there's different versions of the story, but anyway, he had to get 1,000 little fingers off the right hand of human beings, 1,000 human beings' little fingers, and bring them back to his teacher or something. So the only way he could figure out to get them was to kill the person first. So he set off killing people, and he hid out in the forest, and he ambushed people who came along with his weapons and chopped off their little fingers and strung them on a necklace. And that was how he was collecting them, because he tried storing them in a tree, but the birds took them, so then he put them on his necklace. And he became famous as a serial killer that everybody was terrified of. And then Buddha heard about him and decided to go find him. And he went to where Angulimala was, and Angulimala had at that point 999 little fingers on his necklace, and he wanted to get Buddha's little finger. And Buddha saw him, and I guess began walking away from him, and Angulimala began chasing Buddha as fast as he could to catch him and kill him. And he was running as fast as he could, and as fast as he could. And Buddha was just strolling along at his normal pace, and Angulimala couldn't catch up with him. And he just called out, "Stop, stop!" And Buddha turned and said to him, "I have stopped. It's for you to stop. You must stop. I've stopped harming, and you must stop harming." And Angulimala was so struck by his words that he went along with Buddha and joined the Sangha and became a monk, and was overcome with remorse and tried very hard for the rest of his life to do various things, good deeds to help with his karma. And so anyway, it's a story about how even the most terrible, even the most seemingly evil, monstrous person has some hope for good in him. But it's also a story that reminds us that people have been subject to this kind of really senseless violence, probably since there were people. And so I think Buddha would maybe try to certainly bring compassion to all the people affected in Connecticut, And a question that comes up for me because of the Angulimala story is, well, can we bring our compassion to this guy, Adam Lanza, 20 years old, who himself was practically a kid? Not to say, that there's anything but unspeakable horror about the children who died, but that it's a part of some bigger picture. It's like this is one piece of the whole network of all of us being connected, and the violence in this world and the violence of the guns in our culture. It's all connected, and we aren't separate from it. And that's one reason I think we feel it deeply, that some part of ourselves in our hearts, we know we're not separate from it. And my granddaughter, now I have two granddaughters in Austin, Texas, and one is 6 and one is just 2 months old. And last month I was visiting there to see my brand new granddaughter. And my main job, though, while I was there, was to hang out with Paloma, the older sister, who was feeling a little displaced as the center of attention. And and she's an absolutely wonderful person, of course. And she goes to the public school, and she's in first grade. And I took her to school every day, drove her to school, and I picked her up every day in the afternoon. And I would go, and there would be all the kids out in front of the school, and their teachers were there, sort of monitoring who was picking them up, and they were all sitting there with their lunch boxes. And just came, that picture of me picking up Paloma at the end of the school day came into my mind as when I was reading this story about Connecticut, and thinking, oh my God, thinking of my son going every day after work to pick her up at school, and just so that in a way that's another kind of pain that extends out, is that the fear and that we feel. And I was wondering, I wonder if Paloma has heard about that, and is she afraid? And I haven't had a chance to talk to them since then, but there are so many ways that these acts of violence go out in rings and cause other effects that are really painful. So I just keep coming back to how we think about such a thing, and how this person who did this act of violence was not, he was one person. It wasn't a conspiracy. We don't have to get into that, but he wasn't just one person, because he was also a person who grew up in this society with and he had clearly some mental disturbance. He didn't get the help perhaps that he needed, and he had access to the guns that his mother had in her house, and there were a lot of reasons why his act was the result of many causes and conditions that came before him. So that to just blame it on this one individual person is missing part of the point of this whole web of interconnectedness that we're a part of. And in a way, I think what we can do is to extend our hearts to those people suffering there, with the feeling that we're not separate from them, and that we are all living in this same world together. And the death of children is something that's particularly, painful and strikes us so deeply. And as a mother and as a grandmother, I can't think of anything worse than the loss of a child. And even if you're not a mother or a grandmother or a parent, you know how terribly painful that kind of violence is. It's so upside down. It's not the way things are supposed to go. So I wanted to return to some stories from Buddha's time to talk to you about, and to say that I just finished a book that is going to be published next year that I did with another woman, and it's collection of 100 stories and koans, Zen koans, little teaching stories, and also earlier Buddhist stories that are all about awakened women and wise women. And they're very short, the stories are, and then each one has a commentary by a contemporary woman Buddhist teacher. So it brings together 100 women of the past in Buddhism and 100 women of the present. And the reason, and it's not a book just for women, it's a book that's filling a gap in our own teachings. We call it the hidden lamp, because the teachings of women have been overlooked to a great deal in Buddhist history. And all of us, women and men both, have been reading, especially in the Zen tradition, which I'm part of. We read a lot of these old stories, teaching stories, and they're almost all about men. And I don't say, oh, well, I don't want to read that story, it's about a man. I only want to read a story about a woman. So by the same token, we're making this offering to kind of fill in part of our Buddhist history, just as if you only heard the stories of your grandfather, the family stories of your grandfather, and not the family stories of your grandmother, it would be kind of incomplete, your family history. So there are some stories about the deaths of children in our book and in Buddhist history, and I wanted to turn to those. And so you may be familiar with a couple of these. And first I'll just read you a couple of them. This one is called Kisa Gotami's Mustard Seed, and Kisa Gotami was one of the first Buddhist nuns who came and joined the Buddhist Sangha, and this is the story of how she came to him. Kisa Gotami came from a poor family, but the son of a wealthy family loved her and married her. Her in-laws treated her unkindly because of her background, but when she gave birth to a son, they finally respected her. Then, when the child was a toddler, he died, and Kisa Gotami went mad with grief. She carried the dead child from house to house, begging for medicine to make him well, and everyone sent her away, saying, "The child is dead, no medicine can help him." At last, a kind man directed her to the Buddha. The Buddha said, "I will give you medicine to revive your child if you bring me a mustard seed from a house where no one has died." With renewed hope, Kisa Gotami went forth to get the mustard seed, but at every house she learned that someone had died. And so, still carrying her child's body in her arms, she returned to the Buddha. "Did you bring me a mustard seed?" he asked her. "I thought that death had happened only to my little son, but now I understand that it happens to everyone. Impermanence is the universal law," she said. She buried her child in the forest and returned to the Buddha to receive ordination. So it's a very kind of stylized story. I mean, it's pretty, I think it's condensed. I think her journey is somehow mythologized, and it's a beautiful, comforting story, but I also feel like, well, I don't know if I would have such a quick turnaround as she did. So maybe it wasn't really quick, we don't know, but just the fact that she realized that impermanence is the name of the game and that everybody dies helped her to accept that her child was dead. She wasn't even accepting that the child was dead, and so that was an important step for her. Oh, he is dead and he won't come back to life. So acceptance of impermanence and acceptance of our grief is part of what needs to happen. I'm not going to read the commentaries, but here's another story of another member of another woman who was a nun in Buddhist Sangha and had a slightly similar way of coming to the Buddha. And it's called Patachara's Presence of Mind. In a single day, Patachara experienced the deaths of her whole family. Her husband was bitten by a poisonous snake. Her newborn child was carried off by a hawk. Her older child drowned in a river, and her brother, mother, and father were killed when their house collapsed. Mad with grief, she tore off her clothes and wandered naked in circles for a long time, until she stumbled into the place where the Buddha was teaching. The monks wanted to send her away, but the Buddha stopped them and said to her, "Sister, recover your presence of mind." At his words, she regained her sanity and knew she was naked. A man threw her his cloak, and she covered herself. She told the Buddha of her tragedies and begged him to help her. He said, "I can't help you. For countless lives you have wept for loved ones. Your tears could fill 4 oceans. But no one can be a secure hiding place from suffering. Knowing this, a wise person walks the path of awakening." His words eased her mind. She ordained and practiced diligently. One day she saw into the nature of impermanence, and a vision of the Buddha appeared before her. He said, "Padachara, all human beings die. It is better to see the truth of impermanence, even for just a moment, than to live for 100 years and not know it." Padachara awakened and became the greatest of the women teachers in the Buddhist Sangha. So again, accepting and understanding impermanence was foundational to her awakening, to her relief from suffering. So, in some way, just letting ourselves really know the suffering and being present with it, maybe that is the gate that we go through to realize impermanence, rather than pretending it isn't so, like the mother trying to find the medicine that would cure her child. But then there's another story that I want to read you, which is later, and this is a Japanese koan from the Zen tradition, and it's from Japan, from 18th century Japan, and it has a slightly different approach to the death of a child and the grief that comes from the death of a child. And I love this story, and my other co-editor and I each chose one of the stories that we wrote about, and this is the one that I chose. So I'm gonna read my short commentary as well. But this one is called Satsujo Weeps. When Satsujo, a great disciple of Hakuin, who was a great Zen master, was old, she lost her granddaughter, which grieved her very much. An old man from the neighborhood came and admonished her. "Why are you wailing so much? If people hear this, they'll all say, 'The old lady once studied with Hakuin and was enlightened. So now, why is she mourning her granddaughter so much? You ought to lighten up a bit.'" But it's sort of like he's thinking about Padachara and Kisagotami, and he's thinking about the Buddha saying, recover your presence of mind, get over it, recover your presence of mind. Grandchildren die, everybody dies. Satsujo glared at her neighbor and scolded him. "You bald-headed fool, what do you know? My tears and weeping are better for my granddaughter than incense, flowers, and lamps." The old man left without a word. So, I was really interested in this story as a grandmother, and I was interested that she was weeping, and she was defending her right to weep, and what was that about? And so this is some of my thoughts on it. This koan comforts me because Satsujo is being completely human, weeping and wailing over the death of her granddaughter. And this is not quite what I expect from a Dharma story. Aren't we supposed to let go of attachment? Embedded in the story of Satsujo's tears are the well-known stories of Buddha's disciples Padachara and Kisagotami, who came to the Buddha crazed with grief after the death of their children. Buddha's response to Padachara was, "Sister, recover your presence of mind." And so she did, and Kisagotami too, after he helped her understand that every family knows the death of loved ones. As a mother and a grandmother, I can't imagine any suffering greater than the death of a child. That's why the stories of Padachara, Kisagotami, and Satsujo are so powerful. They are archetypal. When I was 2 years old, my mother had a baby boy. My father came back to Chicago from the Army base in Columbus, Ohio, where he was in training, because it was World War II, to visit the baby, and my parents named him Benjamin. When Benjamin was 5 days old, he died because he had a hole in his stomach that they didn't know how to fix. My father got leave to come again, and they buried the baby. Soon after, my father was sent overseas. Many years later, my mother told me that as she was folding up the baby clothes and putting them away in our little apartment, she couldn't hold back her tears, and I stood there watching her, 2-year-old me, and I said, "Don't cry." "Please, Mom, recover your presence of mind." Her tears must have been frightening to me. She was my whole world, after all. But would it have been better for me to have a mother who could hold back her tears at such a time? When is it okay to weep? What was the difference between Satsujo's tears and Padachara's? Padachara was completely overwhelmed by grief. She had lost not only her children, but her faith, her groundedness, her sense of connection. She needed Buddha's guidance. Satsujo was wailing too, but she didn't need to be told to stop. I loved Satsujo for her tears. She was weeping because something tragic had happened. A beloved child had died. But she had not lost her presence of mind. She was able to snap out of her wailing long enough to call the old man a bald-headed fool. I see a pivot point in the koan when Satsujo says, "My tears and weeping are better for my granddaughter than incense, flowers, and lamps." Better for my granddaughter. What does she mean? If she stayed quiet and burned some incense, she didn't think it would particularly help the dead child. She could ask a monk at the local Buddhist temple to light some incense for her granddaughter. That's a good job for a monk. But a grandmother weeps. That's the job of a grandmother. Her tears are not for herself. They are for her granddaughter, and by extension, for all grandchildren. She is expressing what Dogen calls grandmother mind, the mind of great compassion. When is it a good idea to tell someone who is suffering to lighten up? I think this is quite an important question, actually. The old man was not trying to alleviate Satsujo's suffering. He was worried about her reputation, and perhaps he didn't like her tears because he didn't know what to do. He didn't like the snot, and he didn't have any Kleenex. When my mother was quite old, her feelings could be easily hurt, and she would get upset. Then I would say, "Don't worry about it. He didn't mean it. It's not that bad." And she would shout, "It is too that bad. Why won't you believe me?" And she became even more upset. I was like the bald-headed monk, telling her to cool it, more for my own sake than hers. But finally, in the last year or so of my mother's life, I stopped telling her to lighten up. I learned to listen better. This is a good way to help a person recover her presence of mind. Satsujo respected her own grief. It was a sign of her deep connection to her granddaughter. She didn't need to be told to recover her presence of mind because she never really lost it. She knew that children need to live in a world where old women weep at the death of a child, even if they have studied Zen for many years. So that's kind of another dimension of weeping, and how can we support each other in our weeping, and weep together sometimes is really what we need to do. And to just remember that we're not separate from each other. So, our world, is so upside down. It seems as though things are getting worse. A lot of things are getting worse. There's so much to worry about on the planet, and so much to grieve for. And at one level, in the absolute realm, we can continue to seek for some presence of mind and equanimity and just a foundation of faith in our Buddha nature and our connection with everyone. And at another level, we weep and we think, what can we do? And it's totally appropriate to act to improve things as well at the same time that we're seeking equanimity. And for example, now we can do things about gun control. You can call up the White House and say, please, make good on some of your promises about gun control. Or to do these things are really also completely appropriate and are just part of our response, part of making an appropriate response to grief. And so it was actually this morning as I was thinking about coming and talking to you today, and I was looking online and trying to think, well, what things can a person do in terms of gun control, which is a concern of mine. And I just went to the White House comment line, which I encourage you to do if you're interested. It's extremely easy, and you just can Google White House comment line, and you get a window comes up, and you put in your name, and then you write your comment and send it off. So who knows how much good it might do, but still, there are things like that we can do to express ourselves. And at the same time, we can hold in our hearts the people who are suffering and know that we're not separate from them, and try to share their grief and hope that they feel held by us in some way, even if they don't know they don't know who we are or know that we're thinking of them. So I think, I want to read you a version of the loving kindness meditation to end my part of the talk, and then I would really like to have some discussion with you all. And this is a prayer for peace that was written by Maylie Scott, who was a teacher at the Berkeley Zen Center and died about 10 or 15 years ago. She was a friend and teacher for me, and a wonderful devout Buddhist and also kind of social activist. So I love this prayer. May I be well, loving, and peaceful. May all beings be well, loving, and peaceful. May I be at ease in my body, feeling the ground beneath my seat and feet, letting my back be long and straight, enjoying breath as it rises and falls and rises. May I know and be intimate with body-mind, whatever its feeling or mood, calm or agitated, tired or energetic, irritated or friendly, breathing in and out, aware moment by moment of the risings and passings. May I be attentive and gentle towards my own discomfort and suffering. May I be attentive and grateful for my own joy and well-being. May I move towards others freely and with openness. May I receive others with sympathy and understanding. May I move towards the suffering of others with peaceful and attentive confidence. May I recall the Bodhisattva of compassion, her 1,000 hands, her instant readiness for action, each hand with an eye in it, the instinctive knowing what to do. May I continually cultivate the ground of peace for myself and others, and persist, mindful and dedicated to this work, independent of results. May I know that my peace and the world's peace are not separate, that our peace in the world is a result of our work for justice. May all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. So I brought a couple of extra copies. I'll leave that out there too if anybody wants to have it. So now I would love to hear any thoughts from you all about anything I've said or what's on your mind about grieving and weeping and violence, and how do we respond? What do we do? How do we take care of ourselves? Yes.
I go back to the Four Noble Truths. There is suffering, there's an end to suffering, and suffering is due to clinging and attachment and the Eightfold Path. So in my daily life, I with mindfulness try to watch myself and see where there's some type of strong emotional reaction, saying, there's some type of attachment or clinging there. So my guess is, like you mentioned, that weeping would be an example of some underlying attachment or clinging. So I'm a little bit mixed up kind of with Buddhism, because the Eightfold Path is trying to lessen suffering through getting rid of attachment or clinging. So how is, in one sense we're saying there's an attachment there, but it's okay. I'm just kind of a little mixed up.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and that's right at the core of what I'm kind of talking around this morning too, of how it is because of our attachment that we weep. But it's also true, as in the story of the grandmother weeping for her granddaughter, that we are human beings and we do have these feelings, and we can continue to practice letting go, but we also can't really, well, I don't expect to be a person, to get to some place where I wouldn't have these attachments. And we love our families, we love the people, we take care of each other. There's not really a way that we can not have that part of ourselves happening too. If we're going to be full human beings walking around on this earth, we have that human aspect that's in our physiology, even, in our limbic brain or something, to weep when somebody we love dies. And so I think that the Buddhist teaching is not that you mustn't weep, but more at a deeper level to accept your grief, accept the weeping, accept the grief, and let it move through you and let go of it. Let it release its hold on you so that you can continue to be fully alive and fully present for others. But it's a dance, it's a dance between, being a totally enlightened person free of all attachments. I don't know how to get there except from here, where I am now, as a person who...
sometimes because I don't think I'll ever be enlightened in this life, and I don't think there's any others, but I often think, I often make my second noble truth, there's suffering and there is a way to lessen suffering.
Yeah.
That's how I do it. And the story about taking the first arrow and taking the second arrow, there's probably a grief and a reaction to loss like that, but you don't have to take the second and third arrow to make it even worse.
Yeah, probably other people have thoughts about this too. That's a really good subject you're bringing up. Yes.
Yeah, and my response is to be attached to not crying is going to impede you in the way. I think Buddhism is not telling you not to be human at all, but to be aware. And so grief is a totally natural part of our humanness, and to just to shine the light of awareness onto that and that is going to mean it's going to move and move through you.
That's right.
That's the way I see it.
That's right. And Buddha didn't tell these women who came to him, "Oh, you're too attached, naughty, naughty."
Right,
he
exactly.
got them to kind of accept where they were.
And too often I think there's, it's given towards spiritual materialism, but like, oh, I don't cry, I'm spiritual.
Yeah.
It's just like, no, you're actually attached to not crying, really. And
Well, also, I think this is why the monks, people became monks and took all the many, many vows of a monk. They didn't have families to make it more possible for them to engage in a life of renunciation and deep meditation without having the kinds of grief of a householder. And the lay lives that most of us are living bring a further challenge of how do we combine our commitments and our intimate responsibilities and loves with the life of a person on the Buddhist path, and that's challenging in ways that a monk's life isn't so challenging, actually. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for your talk. Really, obviously, topical. And, I've been really watching a lot of the CNN coverage about this Connecticut event. And on one hand, I really feel the grief for them and their suffering. And I have to say, I've also noticed a part of me, partly in reaction to, I think, the dramatization of the news coverage, that there's a part of me that's also going, oh, come on, regain the presence of mind. But
to the news media, say regain your presence.
But in my own life, I've found that as much as I wanted to be stoic about my own suffering, that when I really wasn't attached to not being attached, and could have it, and especially when I did it with others, that I was able to experience what Stephen Levine
Mm-hmm.
You know? And
When you did it with others, can you say more?
as
What
in
you mean?
like support groups or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
Like I worked with dying people for a
Uh-huh.
long time on
Uh-huh.
in the late 80s,
Uh-huh.
mid 80s. And so I saw a lot of that. So it's complicated, but both are true, you know.
Mhm.
It's my pain, and other people, obviously, it's part of my connection to everyone else.
Yeah.
You know, this morning when I went to leave to come here, my car was gone.
Oh,
someone
no.
stole my car, yeah. I found 2 other cars still, and they both were recovered. But you know, I went through that initial sort of limbic fight or flight response, and but made the call, and surprisingly enough, the cops came right away. And I was only delayed about 15 minutes.
Oh.
My friend John came to pick me up, but you know, in the scheme of like all this news coverage about Connecticut, you know,
Yeah.
it's a pain in the butt, and I,
Mhm.
you know, damn it,
Yeah.
I'm gonna probably have to pay towing and
Yeah.
replace that destroyed or something. But it's just poignant. You
Yeah.
know? Like,
Yeah, it does put things into perspective.
yeah, like because I was been some of the part of the news coverage has been watching this horrific scene, and at the same time watching, like on local news, the marquee scanning across the bottom saying 4 people shot in Oakland, some lady in Southern California
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
killing people at the mall. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like so present
Yeah.
in our culture.
Yeah. And also I want to say, just remind us that a mass killing like this is a horrible thing that is happening in other parts of the world in other ways, you know, drone attacks and bombings and things that are where innocent school children are being killed. And so other people in other countries also experience this, but it's rare. I mean, it's a big thing in the news because it happened here and it happened in Connecticut, and that's understandable, but not to forget that this is not an unknown kind of grief to other parts of the world. Yes.
My sister died 2 weeks ago-ish. And just a few days ago, I went with my niece to her house. I was in her bedroom trying to clean up all these things. And it's interesting because I have this mixed reaction because who are we to know that, you know, I'm gonna do my best to express myself. My sister had kind of a pretty horrible death. She was an alcoholic, and her husband basically was providing all that alcohol, right? And so I feel like the most compassionate thing is to give him compassion, but that's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know the order of the universe. He, maybe by facilitating her death, was alleviating suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So who are we to know who these children were that were killed? This sounds crass, but what if Hitler was one of these children? I mean, I'm serious. We don't know the order of the universe. So to project this ourselves into this order seems a little, it's got a hubris, as if things shouldn't be the way they are. And I think that's, I'm trying to find that this is horrible, and I feel angry and upset and grieving, but this guy sat next to me. I was away, and he sat next to me on the plane before my sister was killed, like 2 days before, or before she died. God, I said she was killed. And he told this, I don't know why, but he asked to sit next to me in the center seat, right? And he told me this Hindu story that was about the angel of death. And so there's the god, I guess, of death, and he asked this angel to go and kill this woman. And the angel goes down, and it's a young mother, and she's lost her husband, and there's these 3 daughters. And he's like, I can't do it. I can't kill her. That'll leave these poor daughters without a mother, without anyone, orphaned. So he goes back and says, I can't kill this woman. And the god of death, Maya or something, I don't remember the name of the god, says, well, you're going to be punished because that's your job. So he says, fine, I'll take the punishment. He gets punished. So the god of death goes and kills the woman himself. And then after his punishment, the angel comes back and he has to do this penance. And his penance is to go to Earth, and he has to laugh 3 times. So he goes to Earth, and he runs into this cobbler who says, do you have anything? Do you have anyone? You look like you're a foundling. And he says, no. So he takes him in. His wife says, oh God, I can't believe you're dragging in another one of these like waifs. And the angel laughs the first time because he says, you don't know that these people don't know that I'm an angel. Huge blessing. So he comes into the house. The cobbler asks him if he has a profession. He says no. So he says, you can apprentice to me. So he starts making shoes, and the cobbler starts to become famous because the angel is there and is showing him things and is facilitating all of this. And the Maharaja hears of this cobbler's fame and goes with one of his envoys brings this special piece of leather and says, make the Maharaja's shoes. So this cobbler gives it to the angel and says, you're going to actually help me make these shoes. And it's a small piece of leather. There's only enough to make 1 pair of shoes. He cuts the leather, is making the shoes, the cobbler is doing his thing, and then the angel comes back and they're sandals. They're not shoes. The cobbler's pulling out his hair, saying, oh God, what's going to happen? I'm going to be beheaded. And then there's a knock from the envoy who says, I hope you haven't used that leather yet. He says, why? The Maharaja died last night. And when people die, they need sandals, not shoes. So the angel laughs a second time. And then they're invited to the funeral. So they're there at the funeral, and he meets the son of the Maharaja, the prince, and there's the princess, and she looks familiar. And he asks her story, and she says, well, you're not going to believe this, but me and my 2 sisters, we were poor people, and my mother was killed. When I was very young, she died suddenly while she was cooking. And I was taken in by a family who was a friend of the Maharaja, and so me and my sisters have this success in life. And he laughs the 3rd time he goes up. So who are we to know? I mean, really.
And this was the story that was told to you by the man sitting next to you on the plane before your sister died.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's true. We don't know. We don't know. We certainly, there are forces at work we don't know. But I also think that we know, I mean, as Buddhists, we can kind of have some trust in the laws of karma, that beneficial actions produce beneficial results, and harmful actions produce harmful results. And I don't think there's any way you can think that killing school children has got to be a harmful action somehow. So, I mean, maybe there was a Hitler killed. Who knows? We only know what we know, and so we just go on what we know, and we do the best we can, and try to produce good karma as we go along, I think. But that's an interesting viewpoint, that there's hidden forces at work too that we can't know about, perhaps.
We have time for one more.
Okay.
Question.
Okay.
I just thank you so much. I think for me, one of the problems in my experience is there's private grieving, and grieving can be isolated, but there's no really public way to grieve. And to me, it was very meaningful that President Obama was weeping.
Yes.
On that forum.
Yes.
So I thank you also for bringing this in, because this is a place of community where it's possible to grieve in community and not get isolated. Also, I feel like grieving comes out of connection, not so much attachment, but connection to life and to others. And that's how, in my experience, that's how I know myself, is in part is in connection with others. And to me, that's where grieving comes, that loss of that connection.
I think that's really, I'm glad you raised that. And the connection is what we need to keep. And when we're feeling grief, that's why people have funerals and sit around together telling stories about the person who died. This is what we need to do. We need to share the grief with others and not hold it in ourselves in a corner all alone. So, yeah, it was great that Obama was able to express it publicly.
Thank you, Susan. I cannot think of anybody else that could have been so perfect for us to come today. I mean, the point of view of grandmother is precisely what I personally needed to hear. So thank you so much.
Well, you can all have grandmother minds too.
and you'll be around for
Yes,
for the social hour. So for a half hour or so for anybody that wants to discuss this further with you. But thank you so much. Do we have announcements? Any announcements?
I believe next Sunday we have an open discussion.
We're light on the announcement. And we have a host.
My name is Paige, and I'm the host for today. There's some treats outside, some orange cardamom coffee cake, some cookies, and other things. There's hot tea for water. If you have tea, there's a pan in the sink with hot soapy water to wash out your mugs. We have a sign-up list on the credenza for our mailing list, and if you're interested, check that out. The group goes out. Some people go out for lunch at 12:30. We usually meet at the door. If you're interested, find them there. And then finally, I'm going to be going around with the Donegal. The suggested donation is $5 to $8.
I left a copy of the GBF roster next to the sign-up sheet. We're doing a year-end update, so if your mailing address or your email address has changed in the last year, just make a change on that list and we'll put it in the database.
Okay, so then there's no more announcements. Let's do our dedication of merit and in particular think of our kindred folk in Connecticut more.
Yes.
Yeah. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow. And may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.